Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's MHTV. It's great to have you all join us live, and it's great that we're joined by an excellent panel tonight who are going to discuss a really important issue. Before we go on to that, just to say hello, I'm Dave Munday to anyone that's not joined in an MHTV in the past. I work at Unite the Union as lead professional officer in the health sector. And I help sort of coordinate MHTV. Normally, I would be the social media person when I'm next to Nicky, but tonight we've swapped over roles. Hopefully that won't be a complete and utter disaster, but there's still time. But before I say any more, I'm going to pass over to Nicky, and she's just going to give you some info about how you can get involved via social media tonight. So Nicky, over to you.
Hello everyone, lovely to see you. We're going to have a really interesting debate today, and we'd really love to hear your opinions too. So if you're on Twitter, if you tweet us with hashtag MHTV, I'll be looking online and answering stuff and bringing your points into the conversation, or you can just join in and ordinarily on the Facebook channel. That's no problem either. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thanks Nicky. And now, as I said, we've got a great couple of panellists tonight who are experts in this field. But before we kind of mine their minds for information, I want them both to introduce themselves. So first, Professor Alison Leary, do you want to say a bit about who you are, where you come from, what you've done in the past?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be on here tonight. My name's Alison Leary. I'm a Professor of Healthcare and Workforce Modelling at London South Bank University. So I'm a mathematician and a registered nurse. And I'm an engineer by background, so a bit of variety there. And I have an interest in patient safety.
Brilliant. And sort of that maths and nursing, it reminds me of Florence Nightingale, and I think she was a real fan of statistics too. So, I thought I'd just mention that one. Now, Jane, how do you kind of relate to Florence Nightingale? What's your background?
Oh my goodness, definitely not the maths area. So I do admire you, Alison. That was one of the areas I struggled with. I'm Jane Beach. I'm the lead professional officer for regulation. I work with Dave at Unite. So I deal with all things regulation for our members. My background is nursing. I was a midwife for a while, but the majority of my career was as a health visitor and then working in public health and smoking cessation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jane. So without further ado, we're going to start talking about tonight's subject, which is the Protect Nurse campaign. You can see that on Twitter with the hashtag Protect Nurse and also the Twitter handle Protect Nurse. Before we talk about Protect Nurse too much, can we just think about some information and the background to what protected titles are? So what is a protected title? What's the point in them? And why are they important? So I don't know, Alison, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So protected titles are legally protected titles to prevent fraud, essentially. So the legislation is generally fraud legislation around them. So titles like physiotherapist, hearing aid dispenser, architect are all protected titles in law. And if you use them without being qualified in them, you can be prosecuted. And by use, it's offering services or professional advice. So it's not about using the verb, being an architect of something. But actually, if you claim to be an architect and offer architectural services without the qualifications or experience, then you can be prosecuted.
Brilliant. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Jane, sort of from your knowledge?
Yeah, I did a little bit of reading up on this. So in terms of nurse registration, the first state registered nurse, I was one of those actually, not as long back as Ethel, but the first one in 1919 was when nurse registration came in, and they fought really hard to get it. And the very first state registered nurse was Ethel Gordon Fenwick. And yes, as Alison said, it's a very important part of regulation. Regulation as a whole, statutory regulation provides assurance that people have done the relevant education programme, they've got this knowledge and skills, to the appropriate level, and also obviously if they're not fit to practice, their registration can be removed. So it's a really important part of public protection and something to be really, valued and really kind of hang on to. Yeah.
So obviously one of the big issues with the sort of the discussions around protected titles is about protecting the public. Do you think there's any instances in which they bring benefit to the professions or to the professionals involved? Alison, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think they give sort of assurance to other professionals that they're working with people with qualifications and experience. They also give identity. Protected titles are a source of professional identity for people. We know that professional identity is really important. Somebody like me, a modeller, at the moment it's really difficult to model nursing because nursing is this massive kind of amalgamation of different workers, including people like support workers actually, who make a massive contribution and do a huge amount of work, but their contribution is almost invisible. And so I think by doing things like protecting titles and being clear about titles and clear about the kind of different types of practice we have in the profession, it'll be a lot easier to articulate the value.
And I think you've made a really interesting point there about kind of the people that support nursing and the nursing profession. And I think nursing associate, obviously that's a really new role that's come out in the last few years. And obviously their job, their role does have a protected title. And I suppose it's that bit about, are there some benefit, have they seen benefit from having that title there?
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably will. And, they've got quite a clear identity. The role was always a bit of an unusual role. It was this sort of, it was proposed to bridge a gap between support workers and registered nurses. And we're never really sure what that gap is because we think the gap is in registered nurses. But what it does do is it means we know how many there are. We know how many are around and where they are through the register. We know what their demographic is like through the register as well. And it gives us intelligence about the kind of work that they'll end up doing. So I think in that respect, it's a good thing that they've got a protected title.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And Jane, I know you were quite involved with nursing associate development as the Unite representative on some of the groups for that. So have you got any insight into that question?
I was thinking more really about, identity in terms of health visiting. As a health visitor, when we were removed from statute and health visiting lost its protected title, it moved over to being a specialist community public health nurse, and the profession has really struggled with that. They've remained health visitors, but that's not the protected title. So I think from that point of view, as a professional, it does give you a sense of identity, and it helps you to articulate your role. And so I'm sure nursing associates are, it is a part of knowing that they are, they're working to the standard and they've got a scope of practice. And, I think it's a really important part of supporting people in practice, because then you can, you can better articulate when you feel something's outside of your scope, because you can kind of fall back on, well, this is my role, this is my, my title. So it is a very important part.
Yeah, and I suppose there's that really important issue, isn't there, about, we know that people get to a standard to gain a qualification and to be able to start to do something. But actually, how do we know that that standard is maintained, that they continue to do a safe and effective job? And obviously, one of the key roles in regulation, and certainly with the NMC having revalidation in now, a really kind of clear part of that. I know we've kind of done some of the background discussion now, but now I wanted to sort of focus more specifically about what is Protect Nurse. So, Alison, this is definitely over to you as the founder of that campaign. So, can you just give us some information about why that campaign is how it is, and your hopes, kind of what's happening with it?
Yeah, we started the campaign this year, because in 2017 we published a paper. It was just an incidental findings of some data that we had around the variety of job titles in England. And we found lots of people using job titles like clinical nurse specialist or advanced nurse practitioner who weren't on the NMC register. And these titles were conferred by employers. So employers were giving people these titles. And we found them by accident. And we published a paper and really didn't think very much of it, thought it was quite interesting. And the press picked it up. And then I started to get a huge amount of correspondence from the public, from people that felt they'd been misled and deceived by people that were non-nurses, as they term it. So, and there are a variety of different people and a variety of different situations. So we had everything from school nurses who were really first aiders. One particularly distressing example was a child who had meningitis, but the school nurse didn't recognise it and just waited until the mum came and picked the child up and didn't call an ambulance. General practice nursing, mental health, particularly assessment and treatment units. I get an awful lot of correspondence from the parents of children in ATUs and the acute sector, and increasingly district nursing. And also actually now health visiting, because health visiting seems to have been, now it's local authorities employing health visitors. And even though it's a post-registration qualification, the term health visitor seems to be used quite loosely in a lot of organisations.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I know my experience when I was working in the stop smoking service, we used to do training for, a whole range of health professionals, and two really stick in my mind. I would go into school, and we had people in school running stop smoking groups for young people, and they were giving out nicotine replacement therapy and under PGDs, and one nurse in particular, I remember, she was the school nurse, she was in navy blue, everybody referred to her as the school nurse, and it was only we got quite far down the line in the training when we were going through the PGD that at that point we realised actually she wasn't a nurse and she couldn't prescribe under the PGD. And we had exactly the same with a practice nurse that, again, the GP, go and see the practice nurse. She was giving all kinds of advice. She wasn't a nurse at all. And yeah, it's really, it's shocking. I'm shocked to hear that clinical nurse specialists have got those titles and, in some instances, obviously, and are not nurses. You just, gosh, that's it is shocking. It's really quite scary, yes, because...
Yeah. And I know, Alison, the paper that you wrote around the sort of the multitude of titles that were sort of out in the wild in health services. And I know at the time I raised that at NMC Council, kind of saying, our concerns about that. And we've done it a few times over the last few years. I suppose, at this point, what kind of response have you been getting from the NMC sort of before the work that you've done more recently and sort of more recently?
Recently, we've had a really positive response from the NMC. I think they've been aware of this for some time. Certainly looking at, things like advanced practice. I think they realise there's an issue with that as well. So the different sort of levels of practice that there are and the inherent risk. Nursing is, we often say, nursing is a high risk, high harm, potential safety critical profession. In that if you're not there, then really grim things happen to people, a bit like air traffic control. So you need nursing to be there and be there fully. And that means having people with the right qualifications and experience. And I think those messages now are becoming more common. I think when we first started talking about this a few years ago, particularly after Francis, actually after the report into the inquiry into Mid Staffordshire, it was sort of seen as a bit radical, but it's very normal in safety critical professions to have this kind of conversation. They've been having them since the 80s, but in nursing it's still quite a new thing. So I think finally there is some movement in terms of the regulator and perhaps even policymakers.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Before it used to be said that we can't protect the nurse title because other professions use it, so dental nurses, veterinary nurses, whereas now they seem to be suggesting actually if you protect nurse, they can, as long as they are regulated with a statutory regulator, they can still use the term nurse. And actually that would work well for school nursing. It would protect school nursing because you couldn't use that title unless you were a nurse. So I think that shift is really interesting, and I don't really understand why there's been such a shift, but I mean, it's a welcome shift because it just seems to make sense. I know, we have veterinary nurses in Unite, and I know, they are, they've been campaigning for a long time to have a protected title. So actually, this would benefit more than one profession. So, it's a very positive move.
Alison, one of the things that you just mentioned was about how in other professions it's not radical to have this conversation, but it is kind of perceived to be radical in nursing. Have you got any kind of ideas why that is the case? Why is it that, for nursing it feels radical? And then I suppose the other related point to that is, some of the arguments that I hear as a trade unionist is that it's just sort of a group of professionals wanting to protect their own self-interest rather than it be for, a greater good in terms of trying to push this issue. So I suppose it's your thoughts, is that one of the reasons perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, the radical aspect of it is other safety critical professions do this kind of thing. And it's the regulatory framework is different, I think, in those professions, at least in my experience. So, and this was a conversation we have had around advanced practice and the regulation of advanced practice. It's quite often seen as professional self-interest. If you look at other regulators, so if you look at, for example, the gas safe, we used to be called the engineers, you have to have specialist qualifications to service somebody's boiler. And that isn't about who can do it, it's about who can't do it. So if you don't have those qualifications and experience, you can't do that work. And that's to protect the public because it's a very high risk activity. And it's the same with nursing. Nursing for a very long time has been seen as women's work, as a service industry, as a service job. Service work is really, really important. But I think it's primarily safety critical work rather than service work. So it works a different, it's what we call a high vigilance profession. People, and because there's so much risk inherent in it, you're constantly having to watch what's going on in nursing. Nurses are very vigilant people. So it's not really self-interest, although I think it would probably give the profession a bit of a boost. But it's primarily about people without qualifications and experience being able to practice and offer advice and professional services as nurses, which is a public protection issue.
Yeah, and I quite agree because registered nurse is already protected. So in a way, nurses have already got that protection. It is more about preventing people who've done no nursing qualifications whatsoever, calling themselves a nurse, or people that have been struck off the register and are no longer entitled to call themselves a nurse.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely about protecting the public because in a way the profession doesn't need to do it because they've already got one protected title. But so.
And it's funny you mentioned that, Jane. It's like you've kind of got a bit of an idea what we're going to talk about tonight. That obviously we had an example at the weekend of an individual who was a registered nurse suggesting that healthcare staff involved in COVID-19 vaccination should be hung. So a question for you both, is she a nurse?
I would honestly, she isn't a nurse now because she's been struck off the NMC register. But, it's very hard to believe that a nurse would say that about other nurses. That's what you just cannot understand where that is coming from. I listened to, it was on Jeremy Vine yesterday, and I kind of listened to it. They had her son on, and, very difficult for him. But, Jeremy Vine kind of suggested, well, do you think maybe she has mental health issues? And I, that just feels really uncomfortable to say that, to me, I just think you can't, just because somebody is being quite kind of radical and you can't put it down to the fact that they've got mental health issues. Maybe that's going on a different tack, but it just really struck me that that's just not appropriate. So
it's interesting though, isn't it? Because it's quite a shocking thing that she said, and it's not usual for people to call for other people to be hung, although tragically quite common on Twitter, but not common elsewhere. But also, I think you're right to suggest people can say unpleasant and difficult things and it be completely unrelated to a health issue. That might just be somebody's choice. But I think it feels quite alarming that anyone would say it, but somebody who's ever signed up to be a nurse, who doesn't understand health promotion, who doesn't understand compassion and kindness to other people, who doesn't understand the danger of, in this climate where everyone is so heated and so angry, suggesting that people take physical action to harm somebody when we've seen it happen. We've seen what can happen from that. That's absolutely against everything that a nurse stands for. And I think that's why her case is so shocking for people, because it's not just that it's unpleasant, it's that it's completely at the antithesis of everything we're trying to do to protect life. It's quite a strange conversation to have around. What do other people think about that? Am I alone with that nuance?
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's, value-wise, it just doesn't fit into the values of why you would go into the nursing profession, So it does question, what kind of nurse she was when she was nursing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's for the best that we've all parted ways, for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah. Of course, legally, she can call herself a nurse. So that's one of the issues. So even though she can't call herself a registered nurse, she still can call herself a nurse.
Yeah.
And that's really scary, because how are people, when people are trying to understand what is health advice and what isn't, and what is coming from a legitimate source and what isn't, you're really cutting straight into the centre of the problem again.
And it's one of those, because they know that she will have had, she will have done the training. They probably, people assume she's relying on what she, on her training and, her knowledge from that. So, which is dangerous.
Yeah, I think the other thing it does highlight though as well is how a regulator can be effective, because that person was a registered nurse, said things that are completely against their code of conduct, and have now been struck off from being a registered nurse. So it kind of shows the power and the importance of having a regulated profession. And I think, there is that issue today, isn't there, about how there is this loophole that is quite clearly there because the nurse name is not protected in itself, that people can abuse that they can sort of make themselves out to be something that the public will assume means something different to what it actually means. And that's hugely inappropriate. And I think that's where, it's so important that, Alison's campaign is successful, and obviously the support that we offer to it, because it's not appropriate for the public to be abused in such a way by people that are purporting to be somebody that should be trusted when they absolutely can't. I think the other thing that I wanted to kind of ask today as a bit of a sort of a, it's something that goes through my mind is, how comes we've got this sort of difference between nurse not protected and registered nurse a protected title? And yet when we look in the case of midwife, another profession that's regulated by the NMC, it's not registered midwife, it's just the term midwife that's protected. So why are midwives different? And, should we actually be running a different campaign to argue that they should be registered midwives and not midwives if it's good enough for nursing? So I don't know, Alison, have you got any thoughts on that one?
I think it's historical. The reason that it's registered nurse is because it was state registered nurse and, registered general nurse, registered nurse. So I think that's why. I'm not entirely sure. Midwives have been around for a lot longer. So that might be why. Midwifery's got a very long tradition. That could be the reason why. We could always ask people at the RCN library because they're a font of all knowledge.
Yeah, and I think with midwife, it's got, there's a very strong definition around what a midwife is, and only a midwife can kind of, they have a really specific role. I'm not expressing that very well, but they have
strong public identity. I think.
Yes, absolutely,
yeah.
And they're, it's that kind of feeling that anybody can kind of do nursing, whereas only midwives can attend to women. Well, not only midwives, because obviously doctors do, but they have a very specific role that only they can do, that's protected. So that's the difference. I think their kind of activities are protected. And there's I'm not sure about the definition of a nurse, really. I know we had that. When did we have that, Dave? It was when were we looking at that? Was it for revalidation?
So on revalidation, we were looking at the scope of practice of different professions, and we were arguing that there needed to be a clear scope of practice for health visitors, because if you're looking at revalidation, how can you revalidate as a health visitor against a scope of practice that isn't a health visitor scope of practice? How can you assure the public that you're safe in the job that you do if you don't need to revalidate against a scope of practice that relates to the job that you do in that circumstance? And I suppose it's the same kind of arguments in terms of nursing, isn't it? In terms of how wide the profession can be, how it's not just about delivering care to individuals or communities. Everyone on this call is a nurse, although, we don't day in, day out look after people, directly. But we're still all registered nurses. It is a complicated world, isn't it? But at the end of the day, we shouldn't not do something because it's a bit complicated. We should absolutely do it because, the public deserve to be appropriately cared for and protected. So, I think that's where we kind of last had that thought. I think the other thing, obviously, in terms of consultations that are happening, and maybe one of the reasons why it's kind of rearing its great head at the moment, is that we've just finished a consultation from the Department of Health and Social Care around regulation of healthcare professionals. And one of the questions was about protected titles. Jane, I don't know if you want to say anything about our response to that and kind of what we said about this.
Yeah, obviously the NMC had put in about the requirement to protect nurse, and we very much supported their stance. And I think we've got another consultation now on the specialist community public health nurse standards, and we're taking the opportunity in that to say that, actually health visitors should go back to being a protected title, because we've got the same scenario there, that anybody can call themselves a health visitor, and people, public don't know who's visiting them and what qualifications they've got. And as you said before, Alison, a whole range of new titles are coming on board, and so I think it's a good opportunity to revisit all of the protected titles based on the the regulation changes.
Yeah, and just on that question as well, Alison, I don't know if you've got any comments, but also the kind of wider thing about, obviously the Department of Health and Social Care have a key role in this discussion. Maybe if you want to give a bit of detail about how that might work in terms of the next steps, and obviously in terms of the petition that you've started.
Yeah, we had a very good response from government, actually, much more positive than I thought. And they're looking at job titles and protected titles as part of the regulatory piece. I think going forward, because there is support from across the board, which is really helpful, there's hopefully going to be some movement on this later in the year. I think people like the NMC, because they've got the post-reg review going on at the moment and the consultation for that, some of this might fit quite well together. And so essentially what I'm trying to do really is ensure that everybody's kind of on board with this. And I think it is about public trust. The nursing is the most trusted profession. It comes out every year on the Ipsos Mori polls as the most trusted profession. And I think this is really about not betraying the public's trust. And I think finally we are getting some movement on that.
Brilliant. And I know in terms of your petition, you've had a few celebrity backers. Who's your favourite celebrity backer so far?
Oh, put her on the spot there.
Yeah, no, I couldn't. I mean, it was obviously really nice that we've had, you know, some very high profile people back it. So, you know, Reverend Richard Gold and Stephen McGann, but also actually the support from across the board, because obviously we went to the RTN for support, and lots of people in the RTN have been very supportive. But it's great to get support from you guys, from the different, so the QNI, you know, lots of different organisations. It's just been fantastic, and also we've had quite a lot of support from the private sector. I was quite surprised how concerned the private sector was about this. Which did surprise me, and also local government. So you know, that's been very interesting. I think as the employment market's opened up for nurses in the last sort of, since 2012 really, hasn't it? Since the last reforms, lots of people are employing nurses, but perhaps didn't quite understand who they were employing.
That's interesting.
And I suppose one of the things about this whole issue is, are there any examples of unintended consequences from making this change? So, you know, can we imagine that if this did happen, there could be some negative impacts of it happening? Jane, I know kind of we had a conversation about one of the possible unintended consequences and what we felt might need to happen to sort of ameliorate that.
I mean, obviously with ourselves, we have community nursery nurses in membership, and for a long time they've been looking for statutory regulation, still very much ongoing, but you know, I think as you've alluded to, Alison, they are a profession whose titles have been changed quite a lot along the way. So I'm not sure how many are actually called community nursery nurses now, but obviously if they are, then this would impact on them. But you know, certainly I think they are a group that would definitely benefit from regulation, although we haven't had those kind of discussions, because along with regulation come all kinds of other, you know, obviously cost is a factor as well, because if you're regulated, then you know you have to pay the cost of that. So yeah, they are. It's difficult to think wider than that. I think it could be positive for veterinary nurses, but yes, that's the difficult one, isn't it? Trying to think through the unintended consequences.
Yeah, Nicky, I've been a terrible host so far. I've not come to you properly yet. So, is there anything that's? Well, I'm worried what you might say after the event. But is there anything that's been shared on social media that we should be feeding into the conversation?
There's a couple of things. So first of all, a question from Adrian saying, talking about with the introduction of the third sector, it's great that people have got improving access for people to get healthcare advice. However, it's been used by employers and commissioners to create positions based on task. And the point of the brilliance about nursing and registered practitioners is they can think outside the box. And the argument that they're describing is value for money is based on the ability of healthcare professionals, including nurses, to work outside of the task. Unfortunately, it's mean that some assessments are administrative, and the term nurse has been devalued by some. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Before we go on, he's also added a lot of nurses that worked in addictions have lost their job titles and become drug workers, which is quite a different vibe to it, I would say. So something about value there. And a question from first year, which is, one, they've been shocked by this whole thing. They had no idea that it wasn't that anyone could use it. And I'm not surprised you're shocked. I think when you actually think about the importance of the job and that someone could just say that that's what they are, that is quite shocking. And they've said, how has this happened? I didn't realize it was happening. And then they've looked online and said, how do you go about making changes like this? Because what you've done is quite a big deal. This is a long one, that's why I'm paraphrasing it. And they've asked, how do you make changes? Because from their position, particularly I'd say probably as a first year, it feels like you can't change anything. And it seems like something here is big and is changing. So I guess two things for us to talk about. One, about kind of the value of the term nurse. And the other about how do you actually, in the nuts and bolts way, go about affecting change, making something different.
So that the value, I can take the value one, sure. The value, nursing has been devalued. It's seen as, it was quite an eye-opener to me for a while, talking to people that made policy, as sort of, you just have to be a nice person to do it, and pretty much anyone can do it. And actually, that's not true. Nursing itself, it can be quite anti-intellectual and sees any kind of celebration of its achievements as elitist. And I don't know if that's because it's a mostly female profession, but we've really got to stop doing that. It's important work. It's important safety critical work. And when it's not there, it is catastrophic. The results are catastrophic for patients. 50 years worth of inquiries from Ely in the 1960s right through Mid-Staff's Gospel. You can name them all. The key issue amongst most of them was missed nursing care. So, we've kind of got to get over ourselves on that one. And how do you change things? You lobby to change the law. That's what we're doing. We're lobbying for changing legislation. The issue around unintended consequences would depend on how the legislation is written.
Well, I guess what you're saying is something about understanding how the process works then.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to kind of understand the process, and we worked for quite a long time. So even with the wording of the petition, we worked with the Parliamentary Clerk's Office to ensure that the petition wouldn't exclude people. And we did quite a lot of research beforehand. And I think you kind of come prepared, don't you? And you can be the best prepared that you can and try and take everybody with you if you want to change, because it's something people wanted at the end of the day. And if I was a student now, what I would recommend is that, as soon as you qualify, you refer to yourself as a registered nurse. Actually, if that was in common usage, we wouldn't even have this conversation.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting because obviously the public really value nurses. So, it isn't the public that doesn't value nursing at all, is it? But I think also it shows the value of research, Alison, because what you did, you looked into an area and you found something really interesting and it's kind of snowballed from there. So, that's definitely be involved in research and, be as inquiring as you want to be, definitely, because change, just starts very small and then it kind of snowballs and who knows where we'll be in 12 months' time.
I think just on the questions, Nicky, one of the things that struck me as you were sort of reading them out was the bit about, bringing in people who aren't nurses, but kind of suggesting or pretending that they are nurses, and it's just kind of a cheaper way of doing something. And I suppose it's really weird in a way, isn't it, that why would any organisation want to bring in someone and kind of pretend that there's someone else? And that in itself is a worry, isn't it, that there's something not right there. And again, it kind of shows the importance of having protected titles and regulated professions. So you can actually say, this is the minimum standard that you can expect from these people. And again, that's not just in nursing in the NHS, it goes across a vast number of professions, many of the ones that Jane and I support and represent at Unite. And just thinking about the work I do with clinical psychologists, with people, with paramedics, other sort of professions that have protected titles, that the public can expect those people to operate at a certain level and can have recourse to complain and to do something about it if they don't operate at that level. I think the other comment I wanted to make about I think it was Alison's comment about nursing being anti-intellectual. I'm always really sort of glad about the fact that, you know, whilst we want MHTV to be really approachable and easy to engage with, by gosh, we don't have to stock it with a load of well-qualified, highly intellectual people. You know, tonight we've got a professor and an associate professor online. So, you know, I think we're doing our best to sort of represent nursing for the, you know, the highly intellectual field that it is, you know, day in, day out. Is there anything else, Nicky, you wanted to pull in from social media? I'm noticing we're getting towards the end of tonight, so hopefully not too much.
Yeah, but there's one person who's in, and again, another first year, so thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate that you joined in, saying that they can't understand why people are against it. Like, I mean, they're saying, is it a political thing? Well, why would somebody not want a nurse to actually be a nurse? Like, if you open a can of beans, it's got beans in it. Like, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Who would be against it? Because it seems perfectly logical.
There are some employers who might find it difficult, and employers tend to do either the role to, you know, the substitute hiring non-nurses for one of three reasons. One is they don't understand the risk, and they just sort of they see the work as task. Another is money. You know, people costing less if they're not qualified. And the third, an increasingly common one in my experience, is desperation. Because we have such a big shortage of registered nurses in England, people are now hiring people because they just think somebody's better than everybody, quite frankly. And many of them have said that to me. So I think that's sort of the one group. The other group is, I think it's caused some people to question if it's an elitist thing to do, and are we excluding other workers by doing it? But I think we should give other workers a stronger identity to show their contribution.
Yeah, I quite agree with you. Yeah, I quite agree with you.
And sometimes people just do it with power. So people will, you know, it's just human nature. They'll exercise power. But we've actually had very little affection doing it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You explained that very well. Thank you.
Any more, Nicky?
No, that's us.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So I suppose because we're heading towards the end tonight, it's always the point where Nicky asks for final thoughts, but not in a negative way. So have you got anything that we haven't covered tonight that you really wanted to make sure that we got into tonight's session? So Alison, can I come to you first?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for asking me to come and do this. It's been really interesting, and it's been great hearing from students as well, actually, because, you know, people have a different perspective on things. But essentially, yeah, we're trying to help the public maintain its trust in the profession. So any support for the petition, which is a piece of direct action that anybody can do if they're in the UK, if they're a resident, please do join us, and please do join us with the conversation with the #ProtectNurse.
Brilliant. And yeah, absolutely. Just want to emphasise that from a Unite point of view, that we want as many of our members as possible to sign your petition. It's got 26,000 signatures nearly already. It'd be absolutely wonderful if we can get towards that 100,000 level that kind of pushes even more pressure on the government to have a debate about it in Parliament. But yeah, absolutely important for people to sign it. Jane, have you got any final thoughts that you wanted to throw into the mix?
No, again, thank you very much for having me, letting me be part of the conversation. I found it really interesting as well, and lovely to hear from you all. I think if you get any opportunity to talk to your local MPs, or, you know, if you get any opportunity to spread the word, raise awareness among your colleagues, you know, students and everybody, so that actually we can really get behind the petition and you know, help it get taken forward.
Brill. And Nicky, any final thoughts from you before I wrap up?
We've been tweeting out on the Facebook Live and on Twitter the links so that you can sign the petition if that's what you want to do. But I think that everyone's made some really important points about if you are a nurse and if you love nursing, then protect it, because it's really important and it's really valuable that anybody who meets a nurse knows that they can trust what we say and that we're accountable for what we do. And that if you want to complain about us, you've got the right to do that, and you can report us just as much as you can clap us and say that we're doing a good job. And I think that's part of the contract that we have entered into with the public, isn't it? About how we present ourselves, how we behave, and what we owe them, but also what we all owe each other, which is to know exactly what we're dealing with. And, you know, the way that you listen to health advice is really important, and it's never been more important than it is at the moment. And so I would say, you know, you don't train for 3 years for nothing. Please take action to make sure that the people around you are safe, because that's what our job is.
Brilliant. So definitely #ProtectNurse. Before we finish tonight, I just want to say thank you to our amazing guests, so Professor Alison Leary and Jane Beach. Also to my co-host, Nicky Lambert, amazing as always. And just to say that please do join us next week, where we will be joined by 4 student nurses. And the discussion topic next week will be more than just a student nurse. So without further ado, I'd like to say good night and see you all next week.
Bye.
Good night.